This podcast is called Cool Conversations with Karsten, and today we are going to widen the hole in the book Hole in My Life by Jack Yantos. My first thought of this book before I read it, and while I read the first part of the book, was that it was going to be mostly about his prison life, and that was going to be the biggest part of the story. But by the end, I realized that at least for me, it was mostly about the before and after the book, and about what led to his conviction starting in his teenage years and how he made a comeback after prison to who he is today. There are a few main characters in the book. Obviously, the first is Jack Yantos, who's the main character, author, and narrator of the book. And the book takes us through his life story starting as a high school kid and up. And as a high school kid, he's away from his family most of the time, just trying to keep a job and finding places to stay. He ends up trying marijuana for the first time with his friends and becomes hooked on the drug and loves the high that he gets. Jack also becomes an alcoholic and gets drunk almost every night, which leads him to getting kicked out of the Bacon's house, which was his home that he was paying to live in while his parents and him were separated. Another main character is Hamilton. He's a sailor and Jack's partner in crime. Hamilton is a 6-foot British sailor that is helping Jack and Rick with drug smuggling into the United States from Puerto Rico. Hamilton is a drug smuggler that likes getting paid big money for smuggling drugs. And Rick is a drug smuggler as well, and Jack's boss. He's a huge marijuana user that is trying to smuggle drugs into the U.S. as well with them. And he also has a distinct burn on his head from a flare gun, which is pretty cool. And now we'll get into the theme. And one of the main themes in the novel is the ability of a person to recover from the mistakes they have made. Jack Yantos makes a series of mistakes throughout his story, but instead of being beaten by them, he uses them to his advantage as much as he can. And a conflict in the story is after being caught with possessions of drugs, Jack enters his journey of being convicted and sentenced to jail and becoming a witness to the horror that is involved in being locked up in prison. One symbol that I found is how Jack's life symbolizes the problems that everyone has and how we can overcome them, like he overcame being a criminal and made his big comeback story from being convicted in jail. The setting of this book takes place in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Puerto Rico. A lot of stuff with Jack specifically in his teenage years when he's living by himself happens in the King's Court Hotel and St. Croix. The style in this novel is written in a first-person perspective, which is vital for the themes presented in the novel. Jack Yantos, as the narrator, is the subject of the book and therefore is the key to many of the primary themes. Yantos is a reliable author in that he is telling his own story, and the biases he has are mostly against himself instead of other things. And this gives honest story and helps the reader comprehend what happened. And if told in third person, the real intensity and reality of Gantos' experiences wouldn't seem as real or true. Now I'd like to give a light overview of some of the key events in the plot that happened in the book, starting with the exposition. Jack is trying to get his life together and go to a good college for writing, but he dropped out of high school to live with his family in St. Croix and worked as an electrician, but does not like it and moves back to his town and goes back to school only to drop out again and return to St. Croix. The rising action is after he moves back to St. Croix and is working with his father again and the business goes belly up, they start making shipping crates and selling them. A man named Rick got one made and paid Jack in pot. He asked Jack if he was interested in sailing a boat to New York. A quote from this part of the book is, "All I heard was the number, $10,000 cash." That's all he heard was that he could have 10 grand to haul some weed to New York, not thinking much of the consequences. The climax is definitely when they all got caught. Jack and Hamilton get chased all through New York and the cops find a huge amount of weed on the boat and Jack and Hamilton face prison time. Following action is after he's sent to jail, and when he's in jail he's reading a lot and writing, and he also started to work at the medical center there. Talks about how much he hates being there and he had an opportunity to break out but decided against it and stayed after seeing all the failed attempts from other people. The resolution is Jack Gantos is released from jail early from good behavior. He goes back to school and starts writing books even writes one explaining his story that I'm talking about right now. And this concludes our story, kind of giving us a happy ending to all the bad stuff that happened to Jack and happened within the book. Now it's time for a quiz. True or false? Over 2.2 million people are currently in U.S. jails or prisons. This is true. There is, in fact, 2.2 million people behind bars. True or false? Of the 2.2 million people in jail, there are 2.7 million kids that have parents in jail. This is true and it's sad, but there are 2.7 million kids who have a parent in jail. True or false? There's double the amount of colleges than there are jails in the U.S. False. There's more jails and prisons than there are colleges. True or false? About half of the inmates in federal prisons are serving time for nonviolent drug-related offenses. This is true. Half of the people in jail are just like Jack Gantos and in jail or drug-related offenses. And now for an interview with Jack's dad, Mr. Gantos. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Gantos. No problem. It's great to be here. So let's start off with how you feel with your son currently. Well, right now I'm very proud of what he has become. Of course, for a bit, I was disappointed, but he made an amazing comeback and is spreading his story and making me very proud. I agree, it's quite amazing what he has done after he got out of prison. So my second question is, do you think he would have changed if he had never gotten caught on his drug run and didn't go to jail? When he was young, I always pointed out the criminals and what they did and told him how bad they were. So I tried to raise him to not turn out the way he did for a bit. So I would like to think that he would have been able to get himself out and ultimately become a writer, but I know it isn't that easy. To add on to your response, I have this quote that Jack said you said when he was a kid, and it is, "These folks zigged when the rest of the world zagged, and once you cross that line, there's no coming back. Mark my words." I thought this was interesting and a little bit of foreshadowing considering that he came back from the line that he crossed when he became a convict. Has your mind been changed since he made a comeback from prison about people who have been incarcerated and if they can change? I definitely think it has, but I still think there are some people that will never be super functioning parts of society. But how it turns out gives me optimism that everyone can change. But in prison, he seemed to focus more on his writing, what he was going to do when he got out, and I think that's different than most of the criminals in there because they're just focusing on their current situation in jail and not really how they're going to become a normal person when they get out of it. I have one last question, and it is, if you had the chance to redo how you let Jack live his life in his teenage years, would you? And what would you have done? I definitely would have redone everything about Jack's childhood. And after taking a step back and seeing where Jack started getting into bad habits, I could see it mostly started his junior year when he was away from our family. And of course, this progressed on and got worse. I think if I had to redo it, I would have never sent Jack to live away from the family or let him be so free of his actions while he was so young because he started to get into drinking a bit with the workers in the hotel that we were working in. And I'm not quite positive that this would have changed his outcome, but I think it would have made his life better, and I feel bad for not being as close to him as I should have. Well, thank you for taking the time to open up about Jack and your point of view about his story. No problem. Thanks for having me. Here's a little biography about Jack Gantos. In high school, he decided to become a writer, and that's really what he focused on for his high school career and when he got to jail. But he would have to wait another 3 years until he went to college before he could actually meet other writers and study with teachers who thought writing amounted to more than just book reports and essays. While in college, he and an illustrator friend, Nicole Rubel, began working on picture books. After a series of well-deserved rejections, they published their first book, Rotten Ralph, in 1976. It was a success in the beginning of Jack's professional career. Jack continued to write children's books and began to teach courses in children's book writing and children's literature. He developed a master's degree program in children's book writing at Emerson College and in Vermont College. He created the MFA program for children's book writers. He now devotes his time to writing books and educational speaking. Now we're going to get on to my recommendations about the book. I would recommend this book to most teenagers, mostly because he started going downhill when he was in high school, and I think he talks a lot about where he went wrong. And this can show teenagers a bad scenario that certain things will bring them, such as drinking or drug use. And it also is an inspiring story about how someone who hit rock bottom makes an amazing comeback and joins the society as a normal person despite his past, which can be a beneficial read to anyone. And to end things off, I would like to challenge you to think if you would have the same drive and success after being in prison as Jack Gantos did after he got out. Thank you for joining me on Cool Conversations with Karsten, and I hope to see you again.